I want to talk about, so reading comp, just a quick recap here. We're trying to read for detail and for structure, right? So what does that mean in practice? That means reading the sentence, the first sentence, making sure you understand that. And a lot of these sentences, people don't understand because they're long. So one thing that you can do is turn a long sentence into 3 short ones, right? Now, how do you do that? A lot of these sentences get long because the subject of the sentence is a string of adjectives modifying a single noun, right? So let me give you an example. If I said red cars drive fast, what is the subject of the sentence? Or really the complete subject? Red cars, right? Now, you take a look at the word cars and you add red to it. Well, okay, red cars, got it. That's not too hard to get your mind wrapped around. What does the LSAT do? They don't do stuff like that. They say things like, the congressional delegates who ran for office during the Revolutionary War at a time when the nation was in flux. Right? That's their complete subject. It's like, who are we talking about? We're talking about this group of people that's being modified by a whole slew of adjectives that both come before the noun and after the noun. Right? And so one thing you can do when you're reading a really long, convoluted sentence, does anyone know how long these sentences can get? The first sentence of the reading comp passage? It can be as long as 11 lines. 11 of these lines, and you're not done with the sentence, right? This is why people get kind of lost in reading comp on occasion. In any case, let's say this is your sentence. Well, the first part all the way up to here may be the subject, right? The congressional delegates who ran for office during the Revolutionary War at a time when the country was in turmoil. No verb has been given yet for the sentence, right? And then they're like, okay, well these people, that's, I think Chinese for person, these people, what did they do? Oh, they cried, right? They cried to their mothers or something like that, right? Like, really, what this sentence is it's about these people crying. But since the subject is so long, you can get kind of lost in what's going on. Now, that's one way that they make these sentences convoluted. Another way is to make the subject super long and then to make the verb phrase itself super long, right? So my point here is that when you read a sentence and you don't fully grasp it, especially the first one in reading comp, you might want to break it down into 2 or 3 shorter sentences. And one way to do that is first identify the subject and then replace it with those people. Right? What did those people do? Well, first of all, we're talking about the congressional delegates who were running for office during the Revolutionary War at a time when the country was in turmoil. Okay, got it. Those delegates. Okay, those people, what did they do? Then you move on to the rest of the sentence. Right? You don't try to swallow it all at once. That's where it gets tough. Okay, and another thing that the LSAT can do, I mean really any academic can do, but the LSAT does it, and we care about the LSAT, is that they will take and they'll be saying something, then they'll stop, and they'll define whatever they're talking about, and that definition itself is extraordinarily long, and it ends right here, and then the sentence resumes. And what you have to do is you have to read everything that comes in between the commas, figure out what that's saying, because maybe that itself is hard to understand. You figure out what that's saying, and then you go, aha, okay, let's see, like, got it. I understand what that definition is, and now I'm going to apply it to the subject of the sentence, because the definition is usually defining something that came before it. And now that I know who you're talking about and what kind of people they are, or what kind of theory they are, or what kind of physics they are, or whatever it is that they're defining, then and only then can you proceed with the rest of the sentence. But what do people do, right? You're feeling time pressure. You feel like, hey, I've been reading ever since I was in kindergarten. And I read a lot in college. I hear that all the time. I read a lot in college. And my major was just reading, reading, reading. It's like, yeah, that was like reading books. And then, hey, what's the point of the book? This is read 16 sentences and tell us exactly what was said and what was not said, right? It's basically learning how to be an attorney. And what do attorneys do? They read contracts and they make sure they get it exactly right. Right? And so that's kind of what we're doing here. So what do you have to do? You have to really understand this, then apply it to whatever came before, and now that's clear in your mind, then you continue with the subject. Now, this might seem like a lot of work, but if you can turn these sentences into ideas, memorizing, you don't really have to make an effort to memorize, remembering what happened just happens naturally. You're just like, okay. Like if we take one of these convoluted passages and we work through each sentence and we're talking about it and we're translating it into 2 or 3 shorter plain English sentences, by the time you're done, most people are like, yeah, okay, I get what that passage is saying. And the questions, in general, get a lot easier. Now you can still get some wrong, either because you misunderstood the question or you misunderstood one of the answer choices, because the answer choices themselves can be convoluted, right? So this is really what they're testing in Reading Comp. This is not what they're testing in games, right? In games, most people aren't disputing or arguing about the meaning of the third rule. Sometimes you're like, wait a sec, does this mean exactly one person can go here? In most cases, though, you understand all the words that are in front of you, and it's the combination of the rules that's confusing or challenging. In Reading Comp, you have to make sure you understand each sentence, but once you do, usually it comes together. So that's one goal, is understanding the sentences. The second goal is figuring out how they relate to each other, so the structure. And what I would generally suggest, and this is going to be different for every reader, because some of you are naturally good at reading for structure and some of you are not so good. So if you find that you're not so good, if you're not good at main point questions, if you're not good at primary purpose questions, if you're not good at organization questions, what's the organization of the passage, then you're probably better at reading for detail. You're not as good at seeing the big picture, right? You're good at understanding what each individual sentence is saying, but you don't see how they all come together. If that's you, then I would suggest about a third of the way through the passage or at the end of each paragraph, just stopping and thinking about what's been said so far. Trying to just kind of step back and be like, okay, so the critic is basically saying we shouldn't take over Canada, right? Got it. Okay, cool. Right. So, and basically what you're doing is you're forcing yourself to take 3 or 4 sentences and extrapolate the bigger meaning. Now, the reason I'm saying that for those of you who struggle with structure is that if you don't struggle with structure, if as you read you naturally just kind of always are stepping back and thinking about the big picture, well then you probably don't need to do that until the very end of the passage. And a lot of people, they just read the whole passage and they think, okay, main point is X, right? They're good at structure. Maybe they're not as good at reading for detail. But depending on what you're struggling with, that's one thing to keep in mind. So to accomplish both of these goals, because half the questions are testing your ability to understand structure, the other half are testing your ability to understand detail, I would suggest you read carefully. Don't move on from a sentence until you've broken it down and understand it right here, like in your gut. I don't know how else to explain that. Right? Like you read it and you're like, okay, I get it. I know what you're trying to say. Once you get that, then you do that for a few sentences and you stop and then you just step back and you think, okay, where are we going so far, right? And to help you with structure, that's where I would ask yourself, is this a journalist, critic, or a problem solver, right? The whole reason for asking yourself that, you say, hey, is this person a journalist, or is this person a critic, or is this person a problem solver, is it's like an intuitive way of trying to help yourself think about structure, right? Because if you think about what they've been saying for the last paragraph and you're like, oh, well, they're just telling me what one person thinks and then they tell me what another person thinks, it doesn't seem like they themselves are complaining, then they're a journalist, and that's helping you get a sense of the structure. If you realize that the author has told you what other people think and now is pointing out a problem, and the problem seems to be coming from the author believes that it's a problem, then you start to recognize that they're a critic. That's helping you understand structure, right? That's taking everything that they're giving you and putting it together. That's synthesizing. So, in any case, those are the two goals. And then by the time you're done with the passage, you should know what the main point is, and you should have a good sense of the details, and you should have a good memory of what's happened, because the reality is that when you translate these things into plain English, now you're visualizing them, and it's so much easier to remember things that you are dealing with that make sense to you. Most people don't remember things because they were relying on the text. Like if your job was to memorize what was said in this passage by the text, it would be extremely difficult. The easy way to remember what was said is to translate the sentence until you can see what's going on. You're like, oh, okay, I got these delegates in my head. I can see that it was a very tumultuous time. I can see it was the Revolutionary War, and now I can see them crying to their mothers, right? Then you go on to the next sentence. Now really, that long convoluted sentence, I just translated into 4 sentences, right? I'm like, okay, it's Revolutionary War. It's like a kid's book, right? Kids' books are short sentences. They're like, it was cold. It was the Revolutionary War, right? That's what you're doing. You're taking long convoluted shit and you're breaking it into a children's story. Now, that might seem demeaning, but it's not demeaning. If you can do that, that's actually very powerful, right? If you can translate this garbage into simple sentences, then that means you clearly understand it. You own it. You're like, don't give me this. I can take this and I can make it a lot better. If you just read it though and kind of just nod your head, then it means it's kicking you around, right? It's like, ha ha ha, you don't know what's going on here. And you're like, yeah, I know each of these words, but do you know what they mean together? Can you see, can you feel what's going on? Okay, so that's kind of the goal. In my experience, this ends up being an upside down triangle in terms of effort and speed, because it takes a long time to get oriented, but once you start getting oriented, you can just go faster and faster because you can really start to feel where the passage is going. Like, oh, well, if you're going to say that, I bet you're going to say this next. And they may say something else, but you can really start to absorb the following sentences faster because you understood the previous sentences. It's when you don't understand the previous sentences that it's hard to absorb the following sentences. Like you have to constantly be translating because you don't know where you've been. All right, any questions about any of that? Okay. The only next step is to go into the questions. In general, I would do a loose prediction for each of them and start going through. Does anyone remember the word that most frequently makes an answer wrong in Reading Comp?
Not.
The word not. Not usually. That usually makes the answer right in a necessary assumption question. But most. Most is that word that means more than half, right? And so in Reading Comp, they'll use it and they'll say something like, oh, most of these candidates were angry. And you're like, boy, a lot of them were angry. But was that true for most of them, for more than half? If it was, then that's fine. But in a lot of cases, it pushes it over the edge. It's no longer something that had to be true, but it's not as extreme as all of them. Like if it said all of them were angry, you're like, no, I know, not all of them were angry. George Washington was happy. But, actually, I don't know if he's happy, but anyways. The point is that all is extreme enough that you usually catch it. But most is, it's strong, but it's not that strong. So anyways, I'm not saying that if an answer choice says most, it's wrong. I'm just saying if an answer choice says most, or a word that means most, look twice at that word and make sure it really is more than half. Does anyone know all the words that mean most? Or at least some of the words that mean most?
Majority.
Majority?
Likely.
Likely? Almost all. Probably, which means the same as likely. Usually. Tends to. These generally, normally, these words mean more than half. So you just have to make sure it's greater than 50%. If it is, that's fine. But in a lot of cases, it's not. Okay. That's that.